So on behalf of the Museum of Christian Art, I welcome you all to today's inaugural session of the Heritage Hour, which Museum of Christian Art has collaborated with Goa Heritage Action Group to bring to you. We're starting with the session on the 17th of April, a day before World Heritage Day. In fact, to commemorate this day, which the ICOMOS has organized, and it celebrates tangible as well as intangible heritage. The theme for this year is Complex Past, Diverse Futures. So we decided to use this theme and speak about Goa, its complex past and diverse futures. Our two speakers for today are Tahir Noronha and Sonia Shirsat, both well known in Goa. But a brief introduction on Tahir, I think, will help all of us. Yes, so Tahir is a young architect who works as the convener of the Charles Correa Foundation in Goa, where he leads a team of fellows engaging in urban design projects in the city, as well as research and publications on architecture as a whole. A graduate of Goa College of Architecture, most of his experience has been in design to conserve heritage, both built and natural. Tahir's areas of interest are social work, planning, and public policy, and in his free time, he's an active member of several citizen action groups in the city of Panjim. Tahir resides in Neora and very passionate about all things to do with his village. So welcome, Tahir, and thank you for accepting our invitation to today's session. I hand over the screen to you for your presentation.
Thanks, Natasha, for the introduction. Let me just put my slides up.
Just as you're putting your slides up, if I may request the audience, we will have the Q&A session at the end of both the presentations. If you have questions, you may put them in the chat box and we will take them up, like I said, at the end of both the presentations. Thank you.
Yeah. Small disclaimer, I have a habit of talking a little fast. So if I am going too fast, just drop it in the chat box and I will slow down. Okay. But I'll try to I'll try to be as clear as possible. Thanks once again, Natasha, for the introduction. Today, I wish to speak about Old Goa, particularly I'm pulling words from a theorist of landscape architecture who I like a lot called Kevin Lynch. I'm going to talk about the image of the city of Old Goa, but particularly within this theme of World Heritage Day, where we look at future developments and speculations around the sites. Yeah, sorry, I got muted, but I'll follow a chronological context. To engage with the past, we'll have to start with the history of Old Goa, and we'll look at 4 or 5 notable buildings and sites through which I'll try to support my argument. Then I'll address the present scenario, as particularly who are the stakeholders. And finally, I'll try to speak briefly on a way forward for sustainable development of Old Goa. A small disclaimer, all of the second and third portion of my presentation is a personal observation and impression. And I would be very interested to discuss what your ideas are for sustainable development in the question and answers at the end. So let's start with Old Goa. But before we understand the history of Old Goa, we have to look at the history of Goa as a whole, because Goa has two very distinct histories. You have the Velha Conquistas, the old conquests, which are Bardes, Salsette, Ilhas, or Tiswadi, what we call now, which came into Portuguese hands in the early 1500s. And then we have the new conquests, which are much of the rest of Goa, which really only came under Portuguese power in the late 1700s. And so both of them have, you see, the politics and the culture in Portugal changed a lot also from the 1600s to the 1800s. And so the influence that was exerted on these two areas of Goa is very different. And my realm of expertise really is restricted to the old conquests, particularly to this central portion, the island of Goa, what is now Tiswadi. Uh, but let's look before the Portuguese. The first real rulers of Old Goa were the Kadambas, and they had their capital in Chandor in the south of Goa. Their major trading port was a place called Gopakapatnam, which is now what we call Goa Velha. Eventually, they shifted their capital to this trading port on the Zuari River. By the 10th century, the Zuari River began to silt, and it was no longer feasible for large trading vessels to come up to there. So their major port became another town called Ella on the banks of the Mandavi River. When the Bijapuris, the Bahamanis came in, they turned Ella into their major trading post on the Arabian Sea. And it stayed that way until the advent of the Europeans who started to visit India. As everyone knows, Vasco da Gama found the sea route to India, and they first settled in Kerala and Calicut, where there were a lot of negotiations and issues with the rulers of Kerala. And so the King of Portugal sent Afonso de Albuquerque, a conquistador, and also the first character in our story, with a mandate to find a permanent base of operations for Portugal in India. So Afonso de Albuquerque and his armada of 23 ships, they sailed up and down the coast of India looking for suitable sites to annex and turn into a Portuguese colony on the west coast. Because you see, India was important for them not just to access the spices and the stone of India, but also as an important stopping point on the way to the East Indies, the islands of Indonesia, China with all of its silks. So in 1510, really, Afonso de Albuquerque won the battle for Old Goa, and they entered in. This year is the Church of Our Lady of the Rosary, which is the oldest surviving structure in Old Goa. Since I'm an architect, I will look at the history through the built form, and that's how we develop our understanding of history, really. So when one looks at this building, there are 2 or 3 very interesting things that come to mind. This one is very devoid of ornamentation, unlike most of the other churches in Old Goa. And this one is built in a form that was very popular in Portugal, also just at the beginning of the age of exploration, which is around this time that it took on forms that indicated the ship. So if one looks at the ornamentation, like the little detailing around the columns on this building, you see that they resemble ropes. The windows are little circular ones, which are like in the porthole of the ship. It's assumed that the designer of this building wasn't even an architect. He was a naval engineer, because the early conquistadors, they did not have the manpower to carry an architect on the ship to the colonies with them. So, but for every colony or every invasion, every war they fought, they needed these naval engineers who could quickly erect forts. And so that's possibly also why this building still stays. We keep talking of Old Goa as a place with Portuguese churches, but my hypothesis is that's the only Portuguese church in Old Goa. So in the 1600s, this was a map of Old Goa. If you see in the top left-hand corner what's called the Lagoa, which is a lagoon, it was gradually reclaimed as the city started to grow. Initially, the Bijapuri walled town was the small settlement on the banks of the river with a small wall around it. And as the city began to grow, the lagoon got reclaimed, and what remains is now the Karmali wetlands. But you see that by the late 1600s, the city of Goa now is surrounded by this massive 25-kilometer wall. And I was lucky that with a few locals of Old Goa, we walked almost the entire portion of the wall, and we found a few areas which have been really well preserved and which are still standing today. So on the right hand side, you can see this this huge gate which is near Healthway Hospital, and then if you go a little bit more inside, you see a remains of what we think was maybe a stable. It's really interesting that throughout this 25-kilometer path, there are dotted portions which still remain of this huge, massive fortification wall. Just for context, if one looks at this map, which is more accurate, one can see the word Siddharth is really the city of Old Goa. And then you can see how this wall ran from Ribandar. It had a little fort at Gansi, and then went all the way to Azusi, almost Neora, where I live, and then went along the Kumbajua Creek through Banastari and Gaundali, and came down and met the Mandavi River just before Sant is there. When the Portuguese first came in, they took a lot of architectural forms from what they already knew back in Portugal, which led to, and this is the only one that still stands, which is semi-secular architecture, which is the house of the Archbishop behind the Say Cathedral in Old Goa. Some of the notable features of this building are the slope of the roof. When you look at this, when you look at the slope of the roof, this is a very European slope of the roof, because a steeper slope is useful when you have lighter rain, more snow. Sorry, it allows things to flow off it. Not very good in our Indian monsoons where the wind blows very heavily, because this type of a roof slope tends to dislodge a lot of tiles. Also, what you can notice is that there are no, the windows are flush with the wall. You see, there are no chajjas, nothing that protects the windows from the wall, which in our unforgiving monsoons turns out to be a little bit of problem. But as the later civic architecture began to develop later, and even you can see in the religious architecture, like the Say Cathedral on the right hand side, you can see how they used ornamentation design to inset the windows accordingly. And similarly, this was the palace of the Viceroy, which took a part of the old wall and had these, again, steepish roofs, but you see also how the roof starts to evolve. It starts to smooth down so that the water is not flowing at such a high speed. And you can see this is a sketch from a British newspaper in 1876 on the right hand side, when the Prince of Wales and the Governor of Goa went to mass at the Say Cathedral, and behind it you can see this gate, which is the same gate near the Viceroy's house. So what we're looking at really in the 1700s or late 1600s is this huge bustling city with two walls, one wall almost encompassing the entire central taluk of Goa, and then the inner wall as well, and a major trading post, because it was the capital of, as I said before, the Portuguese East Indies. And when we're talking about Portugal, we have to also very much remember that Portugal were at that time what they called themselves the Christian Kingdom of Portugal. So religion and state were very intertwined, especially in the early days, or in the first 200 odd years of Portuguese rule. And what that ended up doing was that the church played a major role in not just politics, but also development. You know, along with the Counter-Reformation, you had a lot of movement towards the Renaissance, which was a rebirth of art and culture, and particularly in architecture. The Renaissance movement was focused on these ideas of perspective, like you see in the painting school of Athens, in this idea of an end, an axis and an end, and in this idea of a proportion. Nunes Pereira has done these wonderful studies of the Bom Jesus Basilica, which is presently in the news a lot, because there has been this whole debate on, should we plaster this building, is it not? It has been agreed that the building is undergoing a lot of structural problems due to water ingress into the building. And so but it's very important to also understand that this building is not only important because it holds the body of Saint Francis Xavier in a wonderful crypt, a crypt that was made by the Medicis. I'm sure many of you all are familiar with the Medici family, who were the patrons of most of the major Renaissance people. They, for example, Michelangelo and many of the other Renaissance artists and sculptors were patronized by the Medicis from Florence. The Medicis, when St. Francis Xavier died, commissioned the script by an artist called Foggini, and it's a wonderful example of a Renaissance sculpture and art. It's recently been restored by the Archaeological Survey of India, and if anybody has the time, once the basilica reopens, to go check it out. But it's also very much that the Bom Jesus Basilica is an incredibly wonderful example of Renaissance architecture, and it's an interesting form of Renaissance because it's an evolving Renaissance, because the Portuguese and Italian architects and designers and artists would bring in a symbol, and it was all implemented by native artists. And what we end up with is this really interesting blend, syncretism of India and the West. Like, for example, the grapes in the door jamb on the left, or all of the little detailing in this chapel of St. Francis of Assisi on the right-hand side. When one looks again at the basilica plan on the left-hand side, one can see again the symmetry and the proportion that the built space takes, both in terms of units of ones and a halves, and then this whole idea of the square when you look at the courtyard also. And then we have, as Renaissance began to evolve and the basilica's demands got more and more, they made this sacristy, which is to most architects maybe the most interesting place, because this is where typical Renaissance architecture that came in the Basilica and the Say Cathedral and many of the other Portuguese buildings at the time started to develop their own Goan, as Zé Pereira puts it, the Goan Baroque form. So there are a lot of plays on traditional Renaissance building methods in the sacristy. One of them, which is notable, is where they have what's called a cross vault. A vault is, like we saw over here, this type of an archway that is then projected in 3D, which gives a focus towards an ending altar. And then you have a cross vault. That way you don't have to have a solid wall on both sides. You have two arches that cross each other. And then they puncture these little holes in to bring in more light, because we don't have a lot of natural light. And when we get direct light, it's glare. So you need this indirect light, so to come in from the top was very interesting. And the arches over here are not arches. They're actually octagonal segments. So again, there was a lot of play and evolution in this building. And the other thing that happened is that this building started to show signs of structural strain as more and more annexes were developing on it. And so it was the people of Goa who at that time made a noise and got these buttresses built on the right-hand side to push the walls back in, as Joachim Santos says, and support the building as a whole. So we're looking now in the late 1700s at a city which has over 25,000 people living in the core city, less than 2.5 square kilometers. And of course, we're living through one right now, but epidemic disease, especially cholera and malaria, started to spread. And so this also coincided with the rise of our second character, a major figure in Portuguese history, called Marquis de Pombal, who really became big after the disaster that happened in Lisbon in the 1700s. And he rebuilt Lisbon from the ashes. And through that process, he became the Prime Minister of Portugal. And he, being a very secular man, started to take away more and more power from the church. So Pombal's ideas of city planning were in the European version of that time to organize services, organize sewage, have these straight lanes and grids. He drew up a plan for Old Goa to try and make it into a typical gridded city, only preserving what he called Praça Velha, old squares, which linked to cathedrals and churches. And he also commissioned or started the process of what was called the expulsion of the orders, because you see, as the church and all of its subgroups began to get less and less less and less political power, the secular politicians like Pombal wanted to completely remove them from the equation because they were really holding a lot of money and a lot of political pull. One building that remained, and that's the building where the museum is located right now, is the Convent of Santa Monica. Why did Santa Monica stay untouched when just across it the Church of St. Augustine was so badly abandoned that it fell, and all that stands now is just a tower? Is because there were Santa Monica became this place where many noble women from the East Indies were sent to study and sent to take vows of and become sisters of the order. And so it would be a political disaster to throw these people out, because there was a lot of political pull by these young women in Santa Monica. And Santa Monica, to me, is probably the most important building in Old Goa. Why do I say that? I say that because Santa Monica, and particularly the gardens of Santa Monica, was a site of what we call the Colombian Exchange. The Colombian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus, was this international movement where many of the foods that we know and which now we associate with Indian cuisine, like potatoes and chilies, came from actually South America and were tested in these gardens of Santa Monica with samples of various Indian soils. And then we got to know that, okay, fine, for example, the potato takes in this type of a black cotton soil. I don't know, I'm not a botanist, but you'll get the idea. So we wouldn't have aloo in our cuisine if it wasn't for Santa Monica, and vice versa as well. So this is, to me, one of the most important buildings, one of the least visited buildings, and it's still a functioning convent. One of the only ways one can get access to this building is through the museum. So I hope the museum can open soon and more of y'all can get a chance to visit this wonderful place. So as Pombal's plan to kind of grid Old Goa in an existing building had too many complications, what they ended up doing was shifting the capital along. That shift took more than 70 years. It started in 1740 and wrapped up around 1810. It took years to plan the city of Panjim, because Panjim was, as you can see here, just marshland, coconut groves, marshes, coconuts. And then the original plan for Panjim had the whole thing again laid out in a grid. Some parts of this have stayed. Other parts have slightly changed a bit. But you see the Panjim church being the end of the grid has stayed. You see the Alteen Hill being relatively untouched has also stayed. Of course, the marina and all have reduced in scale. This ideal plan never came to be. But Panjim is one of the older planned cities in India. And it was planned by the Portuguese in the 1750s, occupied by 1810. In the early 1800s, a Dutch traveler called Cloggin visited Old Goa as a guest of the Viceroy. He stayed in the Viceroy's house, which I had shown you all earlier. And he drew this map where he found 42 buildings that were still standing, because by then, because of the plagues and all, a lot of the buildings in Old Goa were demolished by the residents themselves and taken to build Panjim. Our team have then looked at Cloggin's map in 2018 and tried to overlay then now what still stands. So everything in blue, it still stands as it is. Everything in green is completely demolished. Everything in gray is either in a ruined form or has changed to some degree. So let's go back now to much more recent developments in the 1900s. And let's look at this house of the Viceroy where Cloggin stayed. I want you all to focus on this little gate, yeah? The gate that was in the Prince of Wales article as well. It used to look like this in 1940 on the left. And in 1960, it looks like this. And this brings us to possibly the largest intervention in Old Goa in 300 years or 200 years at least, which was the interventions by this man, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. He was the dictator of Portugal, and he led a movement called Estado Novo, the new state. He called it the new state, but it was really harping back to Portugal at its days of glory during the age of exploration. And in the 1950s, he was under serious pressure from Indians to get out of Goa because the rest of India was independent, and Salazar was holding on to Goa because to him, Goa had major significance in all the other colonies. Goa being the capital of the East Indies from Mozambique to Macau. If Goa fell to the Indians, Angola, Mozambique, all of these other areas would go as well. So he commissioned a committee in the 1950s to document the heritage of Old Goa. What's interesting to see here is there are 119 buildings that they have listed as heritage buildings in this small area of Old Goa. The old Bijapuri wall is not listed at all. So, and if someone goes and reads a little more carefully, a lot of these are just the roadside cross to Nossa Senhora, the A and B, and so on. But the other thing he did with this conservationist of his called Balthazar Castro is he undertook a deplastering of the Bom Jesus Basilica and several other notable buildings. And in that process, what he did, the idea of Castro was that they wanted to show, one, to increase the ancient look of these structures, but to also show this whole syncretism in a more literal way. So to show the Goans that, oh yeah, your basilica, which on the left is clearly plastered in white lime with only the granite basalt portions left out. He wanted to show that it's also your material in our style. And you see on the left-hand side, a clearly plastered basilica. This photo is taken in 1950 by Souza and Paul. And these photos are taken in 2019 by my friend Lester Silveira, who's documented huge degrees of damage. On the left, you see what happens when our saline water, salt, attacks the laterite stone, because laterite stone is a porous stone. And on the right, you see how detailing is beginning to get lost in the basilica. So the church has recently put out a video called, if you just Google the Bom Jesus Basilica plastering on YouTube, you'll find it. It's one that I think everybody needs to look at and read up about this and build up your own opinions. But it's a very important issue because what the basilica on the right that is in most Goans' heads is only 70 years, but most Goans have lived, grown up and seen this 70-year-old basilica, not the one that existed for 300 years before, which is the one on the left, the plastered basilica. But there were other smaller issues as well, like they started to piece together things and create their own syncretism. So this is what they call the Arch of the Adil Shah, which is clearly two different buildings, two different elements. They have the sides of the doors from possibly a temple, and then the top scroll portion may have even been constructed later. And if one looks carefully, one can see the cemented joints that make up the two. Now let's reach the present, because this is also very important. There's a lot of attention to Old Goa, particularly because of the basilica, because a lot of Goans worship there. But it's also the saint's body being there makes it have international significance. And a major player in Old Goa is the Archaeological Survey of India, right on top. And they manage 14 monuments in Old Goa. Another 7 are managed by the State Department of Archaeology. The other major players are the church, who are answerable to the devotees, Catholic devotees worldwide, and particularly the Goan Catholic community. The stakeholders of tourism, because heritage and tourism are so linked. And then the local authorities, which are the Say Old Goa Village Panchayat, as well as the Town and Country Planning, and the National Monuments Authority, which is at a national level. The first person that I want to use this opportunity really to address a few discrepancies that are in people's mind. The first is the role of UNESCO. You see, Old Goa, everybody says, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But really, if one reads the UNESCO listing, only 7 buildings in Old Goa are listed as having elements of World Heritage significance. We also know that UNESCO does not literally protect these sites. So if, for example, somebody goes and takes a bulldozer to the Say Cathedral tomorrow, UNESCO is not going to step in except to write a letter saying that you have irreversibly damaged a site of World Heritage. We are delisting it. They recently did that in Oman, when Oman decommissioned a large portion of their Arabian Oryx sanctuary. But if the state and the stakeholders are not concerned and they do not see the value in having a place listed as UNESCO heritage, see, what does UNESCO listing do is it gives you a lot of reputation, a lot of pride, and it also draws in international attention and tourism. But there's always obviously the Omanis government did not think that was important for their sanctuary. And so it always becomes important to not put one's hopes on UNESCO. UNESCO inspect their sites every 10 years. The last inspection that happened independently was 2009. In 2020, they were supposed to have an inspection. Because of COVID, they couldn't send an inspector in. So finally, the ASI internally did an inspection and gave them an answer. The ASI are, to me, the major stakeholder in this area, because 14 monuments and the space around them falls within the protection and preservation mandate of the ASI. The ASI's job is to prevent decay, to preserve old structures and not let them fall anymore. What the ASI also do whenever they take over a structure is they document the structure the way they received it. Now, here is where Salazar's 1950s developments have created a little bit of complication, right? Because he changed a lot of buildings up in the 50s, and the ASI came in 63, and they documented the building. So they took over an unplastered Bom Jesu Basilica, and now I mean, if they follow their rule book, they have to keep it in the way that they documented receiving it. So this leads to a lot of issues. You see, even the owner of the land, which is in this case largely the church. This is a map on the left-hand side made by architect Fernando Velho. It's a very interesting map because he's looked at who owns the land around Old Goa. And you can see in the core area, which is controlled by ASI, most of the land is owned red, which is owned by the church. So the church owns the land. ASI also can't play around or do anything without the cooperation of the church. And then on top of that, the faithful, the people who are using these monuments more than anyone else, either as pilgrims or as locals who are visiting it, are devotees of the church. So a large volume of tourism around Old Goa comes within pilgrimage tourism. So when the state government have recently apportioned 100 crore this year towards development of world-class tourism infrastructure with assistance from the central government, this was a major project put up at a national level for bidding, and KPMG took the project on. But this is what happens when an international agency kind of so on the left were their initial proposals. Don't worry, the church wrote back very sternly, and they've agreed to change the designs. But there was soon going to be a heritage interpretation center which looked like a mix of the basilica and a Colosseum placed right in the middle of Old Goa. So, whenever the state is tendering out these huge projects, they're not considering local knowledge, local sensitivity. They're all the time looking to the west, and so we're getting this conflict of heritage and development. And this is the present situation just outside the Basilica of Old Goa. All of these stalls, really terrible signage, no organized parking. I want to just show you all also how the land use development has changed. Google recently introduced this feature called Earth Engine, and I want you to look. Let me just see if this is playing. Yeah, I wanted to look at this area because this is the core monument cluster of Old Goa. As the 1980s go, you see the land is not changing a lot. The Konkan Railway comes in, and then gradually you see in the 2000s, more and more area starts to get built up. Suddenly, as the highway comes in, so much of Old Goa starts to get built up. I think I'll play it one more time just to show you all the kind of developmental pressures that Old Goa is facing right now, because it has these very, very important monuments, but it also is so close to our capital city of Panjim, not even 9 kilometers away, that there are these influences also which are putting pressure on the old city. So my question is, why do we look to the west for ideas? We have so many examples in India itself where conservation can be done well. For example, this is the Taj Mahal visitor center. They actually took a portion of the Taj Mahal Char Bagh and they just mainly changed around a little bit of the landscaping and created a small intervention there. Similarly, on the left-hand side, Humayun's tomb, they needed to make a huge museum. But what they did, they put it underground. So you're not obstructing Humayun's tomb. there are many examples in India where heritage has been done right, and my whole argument is stop looking at other countries. Let's look at how in India we've done it well. This is something that I visited a couple of years ago in Delhi, which I really loved, which is the Nizamuddin Urban Renewal Initiative by the Aga Khan Development Network. What they did is they really tried to involve the community living in Nizamuddin Basti, and took advantage of the importance of Humayun's tomb to develop a lot of other scattered monuments around. And they did it using the people. So they created a whole group of women's self-help groups. They created a group of young youth from the area called Sair in Nizamuddin. And they trained a lot of other people, because the Nizamuddin Basti is in many ways a informal settlement. Some people call it slums. In the Nizamuddin Basti, lot of people there had construction techniques and knew how to build. So they just trained them, and a lot of this area on top is what it was in the early 2000s, and this is 2018. How they really transformed it with the people. So we have the capacity to do it in Goa. We have Goa Heritage Action Group, which are very active. We have a wonderful museum in the Museum of Christian Art. This is how one can argue to do it. Is really one needs to start promoting more and more smaller local strategies, and club all of these local strategies together to compete with the major multinational players who are moving into our tourism industry, because Goa needs tourism to survive. But tourism cannot happen separated from development, and tourism cannot continue to be the same big business will prosper from tourism. Tourism needs to be linked to the traditions and the culture of the place. And I think I'll hand over to Heta Pandit soon, but before that I want to read out a small piece on heritage, particularly on the definition of cultural heritage. I found this on Wikipedia actually, but I thought after reading a ton of definitions, this one made the most sense. You see, cultural heritage is the legacy of cultural resources and intangible attributes. I've spoken about our architecture in Old Goa and development pressures, which are tangible cultural resources. But what Sonia is going to speak about now is more important, if one asks me, which is the intangible attributes of a group or society that's inherited. It's also very important to remember that not all legacies are heritage. Heritage is a product of selection by society. And I hope that with that I can hand over to Heta and we can go on.
Heta, you'll have to unmute.
Yeah, I've unmuted myself. Thank you, Tahir. That was really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for giving us so much and sharing so much with us. It's my pleasure and my privilege to welcome on this session my good friend Sonia Shirsat. And before that, I just wanted to go back a little bit to what Tahir has said about the Our Lady of Rosary Church, when he described it to look that had manual-line features. And that got me thinking, you know, we always, dear friends, we always try to put ourselves and other subjects we study, the topics we study, into little boxes. Architects will only do architecture, history, historians will only do history, and so on. But here I felt, when I keep looking and keep going to Our Lady of Rosary Church, that we have an opportunity here to mash intangible cultural heritage and tangible cultural heritage together, which is why I thought of inviting Sonia to talk to us today about the future of Fado. And think of all those armadas, think of all those people who left their shores, their families, and went on voyages for years together. What happened to the women they left behind? The sadness, the solitude, the tragedy, the uncertainty that they must have faced, not knowing whether their loved ones were coming back at all. And I think Sonia is the best person to tell us, through her song, through the Fado, what it must have felt for these women. So thank you, Sonia, for joining us. I'm just going to read a little bit of her biodata. Sonia is the recipient of National Award Ustad Bismillah Khan Yuva Puraskar 2016 from the Sangeet Natak Academy, Government of India, New Delhi. Yuva Srujan Puraskar, Government of Goa. Sonia was born in Ponda in Goa, where she did her basic studies till graduation in commerce in her hometown Ponda. She then went on to do her bachelor's in law, finally a master's in law with a first class from V.M. Salgaonkar College of Law. She taught law as professor without any formal training in music or in song. She has made a mark in the music scene in her state, in our country, and abroad. Through her career spanning nearly 20 years, Sonia has sung in 15 languages in 19 countries, and she has been called the Ambassador of Goan music to the world. A pet project, Fado de Goa, aims at promoting and preserving the Fado in Goa, through which over 400 students have benefited till date. So Sonia, thank you for joining us. On behalf of MoCA and GHAG, I welcome you to this session and we are waiting to hear you.
Thank you, Hita. First and foremost, thank you for this invitation, Museum of Goa as well as Goa Heritage Action Group. And thank you, Tahir, for a lovely, lovely talk. Well, I would be talking basically on the fate of the Fado. We're talking about the past and we're talking about the future as well. So I'm going to be doing a small presentation where we have
Sorry, Sonia, can you share your screen? Are you able to share your screen? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, we're talking about. Can you see the presentation? Somebody? Yeah. Okay. So we're basically talking about the Fado, and the presentation is called the fate of the Fado, because the word Fado itself means fate, and it also means destiny, and it's very interesting to know that the Portuguese dictionaries had this word Fado, meaning, and the only thing it had was fate or destiny, till roughly the late 1800s. So the music genre evolved, the music genre was born, but it got included in the dictionaries about half a century later. So let's just go through the fate of the Fado. So the birth of the Fado. Well, everyone questions what is the origin of the Fado and from where did the Fado come. There are a lot of theories, but the exact point or the rough idea is very difficult, because there are theories that it had influence from Africa. There are theories that it had Arabic influence, influence from Spain, and there's a very recent theory where they say that it didn't come from outside Portugal, but it came from within, from another zone called Alentejo. There is a folk form there, which is sung generally by a group of men. So this latest theory says that these workers from Alentejo came to build Lisbon, came to live in Lisbon, and missed home. So they would start singing the Fado. Now, that's how the Fado started. That's one theory. The other one is about the sailors, as Hita was talking. The sailors that left the city to discover new sea routes, new lands for trade, they missed home, they sang Fado, missing home. The loved ones, the women, the mothers, the wives sang Fado, waiting for their menfolk to return. Sometimes they never return. And so that's how they say the Fado evolved. Therefore, there are a lot of influences, but the exact origin is really not known to us. So the beginning of Fado, when Fado was a baby, how did it happen? So it started taking shape in the 1820s, is what has been recorded or what generally has been stated. 1820s was, I think, after or during the rebuild of Portugal, after that huge earthquake that Tahir also made reference to, and Marquês de Pombal then designed the new city. So I think it was definitely after that. And what happened was there were a lot of laborers that came into the city to build the city. And as I said, they left home, other regions of Portugal, and they were living far away from their loved ones. These were very, very low income strata people. These were people from, again, lonely, many of them without families. And they say that the Fado started from these very, as I would say, shady zones of the city. Now, we talk about, and there's a lot of importance given to Maria Severa and the 13th Count of Vinhos. This lady, Maria Severa, who died at the age of 26, was in love with the Count, and they could never be one. This affair was in the 1820s, because she died in 1826. And this love affair between these two has been given so much of an importance because she used to sing the Fado. She was the daughter of a prostitute, but she used to sing the Fado. And this Count, who was in love with her and they were having an affair, used to visit these Fado circles, and he used to play the Portuguese guitar. So there was this connection between these two. And during that lifetime, during that love affair, there was a lot of Fado that developed. So when people ask what's the beginning of the Fado, a lot of people make reference to this couple. Of course, she died young and he lived in his late 70s, but that's another story. Why to these people, and why to this zone of Moriria, or this area where you had all these labor class population? Because the Fado, as I said, came from the people, it came from the masses, especially those who had gone to the city to work, leaving their homes. This is the time when the basic categorization of Fado happened. So the Fado started developing, it got this name Fado. There were certain characteristics that were then associated with this music form. And the basic three styles, that is types, that is Corrido, Moriria, and Menor, actually took shape. And from there, again, many other traditional Fados were born. So this basic categorization happened around this time. This was a music form popular, as I said, in the low strata of society. And this was a genre which was basically for expression of anguish. Sometimes it was regarding a bad day at work. Sometimes it was about missing family far away. And this was the type of music, and this was the type of lyrics that were put into the Fado at this stage. The Fado grew up. The Fado grew out of that, that zone. And in the 1870s onwards, which is roughly around the time that Fado, the genre of music, got included in the dictionaries, the recognized dictionaries of Portugal. Around this time, the traditional structures were formed. Exactly what do you mean by a traditional Fado? What are the rules? And it was given a more sophisticated and a more structured style, rather than just being a song that anyone would sing on a corner of a street. Here, during this phase, the Fado reached the aristocratic circles. You have a lot of nobility that took to the Fado, musicians, composers, lyricists, as well as fadistas, Fado singers. So all of a sudden, in this phase, the Fado became a very, very stylish, a very cultured, a refined type of music form. And therefore, it sort of got elevated and a lot of importance. So this was basically the time when Fado was growing up and turning into this beautiful young lady. Because of the aristocratic families, nobilities that liked the Fado, you have at this particular phase the piano also being applied in this genre. Piano was an instrument that only those who had a lot of money and who had big halls would accommodate a piano. So you had the piano also entering the Fado, which is a slightly unknown fact in the Fado. This was also happened because a lot of people who had learned classical music to read, to write, to compose were now singing and composing the Fado. So sheet music also entered Fado in this particular phase. And then it went into its prime years, roughly 1930 to 74. Fado was being played everywhere. Fado was being played on the radio. It was in the movies. It was in the popular theater that they call Teatro fadista. It was going abroad. It was traveling all over the world. And Fado all of a sudden was a very happening thing. And these were its prime years. It had excellent artists at this time, and each one bringing their own flavor into the Fado. Many of the known names are there on the screen. You have Alfred Marceneiro, who was before Amalia, and then Amalia came in. And there's, of course, Maria Teresa de Noronha, who comes from the noble families. You have Lucilia do Carmo, who is the mother of Carlos do Carmo, who recently passed away on the 1st of Jan. Edminia Silva, and many other fadistas. So these were the artists who then took Fado to another level, because each one of them was putting in their own flavor. Of course, the most notable were Alfred Marceneiro and Amalia. And for us, it's more Amalia, because Amalia then moved all over the world, and she got into the French movies, she got into Portuguese films, and she took the Fado with her. And then the Fado, really crossed boundaries and reached audiences all over the world. So there's absolutely no debate as to the fact that Amalia has contributed so much to the Fado as a music genre. Her style of singing, sort of changed the path of the Fado from the way it was being sung. So if you listen to Alfred Marceneiro, and then you listen to a male fadista post Amalia, you'll find the difference, because Amalia actually turned the Fado in a particular style, which now the younger fadistas refer to whenever they want to come up with something new. So this was the prime era. But why do we say 74? Because in 75 you had the Carnation Revolution, you had the downfall of the dictatorship. Salazar the dictatorship was out, and the Carnation Revolution happened. Now, this was actually a troubled time for the Fado. Why? Because a lot of people associated Fado with the old regime. And if you were a diehard Fado fan, or you went to Fado houses to listen to Fado very regularly, that meant you were still maintaining the old regime. You were still trying to live in those days, which now had been changed through the revolution. So you had a lot of people who didn't support, or rather didn't look at Fado as something nice, because they associated it with the dictatorship. Therefore, there was a huge downfall. A lot of Casas de Fado stopped, they closed. A lot of fadistas were unemployed. It was a real bad phase for the Fado. And when this happened, you realize, so what were the people really looking out for? This was a phase when rock music was taking over. You had a lot of Portuguese rock and roll bands emerging, and people associated this music with happiness, with joy, with a new life because of the revolution. And they didn't want to go back to that sad, melancholic style that was so much the Fado. So they wanted to move on. I guess that's what they felt. And this lasted for a little while. But after some time, in the 1990s, it's about 15 odd years. After that, they realized that the Fado was the style of music that actually came from their heart, that actually spoke out what their soul felt. And it re-emerged, it came back. Of course, it was modified a little. Amalia came back. Amalia started working with Fado again. And along with her, there were also other fadistas that then sort of followed. Now, new style Fado appeared, and it started getting popular among the masses. This was slightly different from Amalia's Fado, from Edminia Silva, from all the others, from the older generation. And this new style, for example, the way of carrying the oneself by the artist, the image of the artist, the style of dressing of the artist, the stage setup during a performance, all these sort of things were modified, and this new look was given. And one of the main artists in this time was Kamane, from this generation. So he's actually one of the senior most in the new generation fado singers. So Kamane, and then you have Marisa. I mean, it was traditionally all fadistas had longish hair because they would leave their hair and would sing out all their pain. And all of a sudden, there is this very extremely short haircut, blonde, highly gelled hairstyle, tall lady singing the fado, and Marisa completely gave it a different image. Likewise, you had Mafalda Arno, who's an architect, Katya Guerrero, who's a doctor, who left their professionals and came into the fado. So there was this huge change. Dulce Ponce, who is more of a classical singer, took up some fado and modified them. So all of a sudden, some fado were sounding very, very different. And this popularized the fado and helped it resurrect and come back into the as one of the main music forms of Portugal. And yes, of course, fado was traveling everywhere. Now it's flying high, 2005 onwards. So after its downfall and then the revival, now suddenly it's gone really high. It's got popular all over the world, and it was declared in 2011 by Unesco as an intangible heritage of humanity. So you have this sort of elevated its position, and as Tahir said, UNESCO really doesn't give you any financial help, I believe, for these heritage, intangible heritage or tangible heritage that are listed with them. But of course, it does give a huge boost to that particular, in this case, to this particular genre. And then you have, of course, the 2000 plus artists, the artists that appeared in this millennium, like Ana Moura, Ricardo Ribeiro, Raquel Tavares, and Pipo Rosetta, Mark Rodrigues, and so many more. And now there are even more recent ones. Ana Moura has, of course, excelled among all of them. She has collaborated with artists in New York and all over the world. And she has, of course, made her mark in the world of fado. And so have all the others. But all this has changed because it's now become an art form well recognized all over the world, not just among the Portuguese-speaking communities or among the Portuguese communities living abroad or the ex-Portuguese colonies, but you have this music genre being appreciated in world music scenario and all over. And now the fado has festivals. Earlier it was called Caixa Alfama, now it's called Santa Casa Alfama. And then there's another one, I think Santa Casa, there's another place that they have. So there are these festivals of fado that are happening, and that also gives a big boost, a 3-day festival. And you have artists of different age categories coming and performing. Of course, you also have musicians with the Portuguese guitar performing. So you have all these new things happening about the fado, and it's really, flying high. And we hope that in the future it goes further. Now we come to the Goan scenario. Just a small comparison with what happened in Portugal to the fado and what happened in Goa. So somewhere in the late 1800s, there's again no proof. Maximum that what gave me an idea that it was the late 1800s is because I have seen a couple of books printed by Typography Rangel in Bastora in the late 1800s, I think 1890s basically, which has the scores for music students of piano and guitar. So the songs that are listed there, it's a mixture. There are English songs, there is Mando from Goa, and there is fado. So that means roughly in the late 1800s, somebody was learning or teaching the fado in Goa already. Now we don't have proof, we don't have documentation of who sang the fado or who played the fado at that time, but it's known. If these books were being printed in Goa and had Konkani in it, they had Mando in it, then probably it was for a Konkani speaking student or a Konkani music lover. So somebody from here who would know that music and would also include the fado in the repertoire. So in the late 1800s, we have rough proof that fado was already in Goa. So mind you, going back to the earlier slide, 1820s is when they say the fado emerged in Portugal. So before that century ended, it was already in Goa. So we have to realize that it came quite quickly to Goa. Now this entered the repertoire of the aristocratic Goa community and society. You had a lot of people who were already singing the mandor, and then they would also sing the fado. You know, so you had this. It was considered a very important element in your singing repertoire. And it's also known that Portuguese guitars, which is the instrument, Portuguese guitars, the instrument.
I think there seems to be a problem. I can't hear Sonia. There seems to be some technical glitch. Heta, you'll have to unmute if you have to speak. We'll just give Sonia a few minutes to. Heta, you have to unmute.
Okay.
Okay.
I was just wondering if we could take questions for Tahir while we're waiting for Sonia to get back.
So we'll not
that?
open the chat box as of now. We'll just, if anyone has a question for Tahir till Sonia gets back on the gets her network connection. Anyone has questions for Tahir? I'll have to unmute. I expect you all to be very respectful with your questions. I've unmuted, so you can unmute yourselves and ask Tahir any questions related to the presentation.
May I ask a question?
Yes, Nerissa, you may go ahead, please.
Thanks. So I found that really, really fascinating, and it brings in a lot more perspectives than we usually hear in the common discourse when we talk about architecturally important or culturally important sites or constructions. I wondered towards the end that Tahir mentioned, the later influences and the management of such sites and the balance between what to conserve and what we deem should happen in the future. I just wondered, how do the sort of Goan diaspora, either in Goa or elsewhere, continue to engage, find out, and contribute to such a discourse with the stakeholders that are, important in this space?
That's a very interesting question because more and more our government are pushing back against diaspora getting involved in what they call our own issues, right? But according to me, I do think that the Goan diaspora will play a very, very important role in management of our Goan heritage for two reasons. First of all, it is funding. The ASI and the State Department are underfunded, and so that is one way that we've seen in this world, money is power, and the diaspora have vast amounts of money. If we can somehow or the other find a way to channelize it, club it together, and bring together some sort of a positive development, that's one. The other thing is that Goan diaspora are still Goan. They're still way more connected with Goan culture than any multinational consultant that more and more we're seeing are being brought in. Because even Goan diaspora have been, those who are born abroad have still been brought up with the intangible heritage. And I see Sonia's back on.
Sonia's back.
With the intangible heritage of being in Goa, which brings a far more sensitivity. So what we can do is, all of us in Goa, out of Goa, we have relatives in Goa. We know people in Goa. We start speaking to locals and asking them to speak up for their tangible and intangible heritage. I think we can go back to the general presentation now.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tahir and Nerissa, and thank you all for your cooperation and understanding. We'll go back to Sonia's presentation now, and I'm going to mute all of you again till we end Sonia's session. Sonia, just give me a minute. Okay. Yes, Sonia, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tahir, also. I'm sorry for that. So basically, we saw that these instruments, the Portuguese guitars, were being constructed in Goa, and this was a phase which shows that Fado was already here, and it was being sung, I don't know, I hope somebody had also composed a Fado or written a Fado at that time here in Goa. In 1900s, you see a lot of Fado being played on the radio, Emissora Nacional. You had a lot of people listening to Fado. Of course, majority of it was Amalia, but I believe also other artists were being broadcasted through the radio station. And there were very few, but there were certain performances. I have been informed that this very good artist called Max had performed at the steps of Panjim Church, Mary Immaculate Church. There was also a small choir from Coimbra that came and performed here. And of course, in 1990, Amalia herself performed at Kala Academy. So these were very few performances of renowned artists from Portugal here in Goa, but they did happen. What did the new millennium, what did the new millennium bring about? The new millennium gave us a lot of stuff. The new millennium brought a lot of support, a lot of, I would say, a lot of guidance for the Fado in Goa. So we started off with Ve Cantar, which is the annual Portuguese singing competition, organized jointly by Rosary College, Navili, and Funda Saumariant. And Ve Cantar gave a platform to youngsters as well as seniors, everybody of all ages, to perform songs in Portuguese. Now, as Vem Cantar has, I think, over 20 years now, Vem Cantar developed and it then started a group category as well. You realize that a lot of solo artists or solo participants started choosing fados. And this gave an opportunity for them to sing the fado in front of an audience rather than just in those family get-togethers that were happening. So Vem Cantar was a huge boost to artists there. I remember a particular Vem Cantar competition where about 80%, if I'm not mistaken, finalists had chosen fados in the solo category. So that really showed that, you know, it was giving them a huge boost. At the Month Music Festival, again organized by Fundação Oriente with support from Cidade de Goa, Month Music Festival brought fado singers from Portugal. So there was a choir from Coimbra that came at the Month. You had Marco Rodrigues at the Month. You had recently Pedro Moutinho at the Month. You had, you know, artists that were brought by Fundação from Portugal, fadistas, to perform at the Month. So that was another big boost. So did Semana de Cultura, this group of people that were working towards the Indo-Portuguese culture preservation through the festival of Semana, brought in artists. Mariana Bobon was brought by them, Cuca Roseta was brought by them, and they had these concerts with, you know, with their musicians, with their sound and light technicians. So we really got to experience what a fado concert of an international level was like in person sitting here in Goa. So we had this all happening in the new millennium. All the names of various artists that have performed in Goa are there. I think Pedro Moutinho is missing by mistake. I've not included his name. And that's how a lot of, since the international artists started coming here, the new generation ones, and performing, it sort of gave a lot of encouragement to the youngsters to sing fado for Vem Cantar. Then we had another thing I missed here is the fado singing competition, which started in 2011, I believe. And this competition also gave a huge boost to fado singers, and they wanted to, you know, really perform fado extremely well. So there's a couple of projects that I mentioned there, which we tried in Goa, and I think they worked really well. Again, to popularize the fado. Fado in the City was a small project we did in 2016, which was again to popularize the fado, especially in to the audience that has never experienced the fado. So we would try to go to places where people, or rather to audiences where people didn't speak Portuguese, or rather didn't have anybody in the family who was a fado lover, and bring them, you know, and introduce the fado to them. And many of them really fell in love with the fado. Today, many of them are our students in the next project called Fado de Goa. Fado de Goa started in towards the end of 16, beginning of 17 actually, with the support of the Taj group of hotels under their CSR, and they helped us tremendously. I have to mention Mr. Ravi Nishchal here, and we had 4 batches with them, wherein we were teaching fado theory as well as singing the fado to people of all ages, from Margaon, Panjim, Vasco. And then later on, we had the Deccan Heritage Foundation supporting us, and we did a batch in MAPSA. So through this, we've reached out to over 400 students, and a lot of them are showing interest in the fado. Now in COVID times, we've moved to online. And yes, it is difficult, it's different to teach the fado this way, but at least we are going ahead, and we're, you know, trying to get more people into this world of the fado. Similarities, when you talk about what happened in Portugal and what happened in Goa, roughly the graph, or rather the fate of the fado, has a similar graph. In Portugal as well as in Goa, the fado had a downfall when the regime changed. So there they associated it with Salazar, and naturally here they associated with the Portuguese rule. So there in 74, here in 61, we have to understand that this change that happened in the regime created a big, what I would say, a big depression. It was a huge fall actually in the popularity of fado in both the places. The revival came some years later. In Portugal, it was around 1990. Here, it was roughly in the new millennium. And the present phase in Portugal and the present phase in Goa, I don't know if I can say that, but I think at the moment, the Fado is doing the best that it ever has in both these places. So you have a lot more happening for the Fado. You have a museum of Fado in Lisbon. You have a festival of Fado, more than one. You have lots of competitions of Fado happening in Portugal. Likewise, here in Goa, we have, except for the COVID, but we've had a Fado competition. We have Vekantar happening. You have Fado classes going on. You have youngsters taking up the Fado. They want to learn the Fado. You have people from outside Goa who want to learn the Fado. They have no connection with Portuguese Goa at all, but they like the music, because that's basically what Fado is. It's a beautiful genre of music which happens to be sung in Portuguese, but other than that, it's such a lovely music form, and it has been in Goa for so long. The whole idea of Fado de Goa is to preserve Fado in Goa for the future generations, and because it has lived here, as I said, roughly from the late 1800s, it's slightly younger than the Fado in Portugal. Of course, there it has flourished and it's become an identity of the country, but here it has lived as one of the art forms. So that's basically what I had to say about the fate of the Fado, the graph of the Fado. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. That was wonderful, as always. And here, friends, Sonia has told us something about intangible cultural heritage, something that touches our hearts, while Tahir has given us an insight into Old Goa and the tangible cultural heritage, something that we can touch with our hands and our hearts. So over to you, Natasha, for the Q&A and the wrap-up.
I will invite questions now, and like I said earlier, please be respectful with your questions to all our audience members. It was unfortunate what happened in between the session, but I think these are all learning experiences for all of us to go into a registration mode for the next session. Nonetheless, I now throw open the Q&A. If any one of you has a question for Tahir or for Sonia, please go ahead, one at a time if you can.
Cheta, I think you're muted.
Yeah, she's mute.
Natasha, can you unmute Heta?
Oh, she can unmute. Yes, I've given the control over.
Okay.
She's still on mute.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question for Sonia. Sonia, have you ever come across a similar genre of music in India, within India? I am thinking of the migrant population, for example, men leaving UP, Bihar, Orissa, for example, and the women being left behind. Do they also have a similar genre of song? Do you know?
You're on mute. Mute.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I don't know about the present migrant population and if there is any genre that's emerging from there. But if asked to compare the Fado with an Indian style, for me the closest would be the ghazal. Of course, somebody has also tried to say that it would also be very similar to Thumri, but I think Thumri would be more, could maybe part of it, but I think it's more of the ghazal, because Fado is not only about love. Fado is not only about missing your the man of your life. It could be your son, it could be your land, it could be your home, it could be your horse, the dog in the house, So Fado could be that way as well. It could be an anguish you feel for the type of life you're leading today, and you're missing the life you led earlier. And you find these sort of topics in a lot of ghazals. So I would consider that the ghazal would be the closest among the Indian music genres. Yeah.
Saudade, like I think that feeling, Saudade, like that feeling, that longing, or that will never come back, or something someone, maybe that word.
Saudade is a word that is very difficult to explain in English. It's a mixture of everything. It's a mixture of yearning, longing, missing, memories.
Yeah, or that.
It doesn't always have to be sad. It can be happy. Yeah, so I
also.
guess a lot of saudade is there in what.
Yeah.
Can I make an observation?
Yes, please, Edgar.
I just want to make some observations. The role of UNESCO. I think the role of UNESCO, who are located in Paris, is to promote heritage. And they're doing a very wonderful job. Goa is very fortunate, the small state of Goa. We have 3 areas which are in UNESCO's list. We were first my wife and I were very happy to hear Sonia. We miss no opportunity to hear her wherever she is singing, but to get the whole history in the form she has explained is wonderful. So it's part of an intangible heritage, and Goa has played, as she has rightly explained, a very prominent role in promoting what could have otherwise been a dying art. So it's kept alive around the world. The second is, of course, preservation and protection through the Archaeological Survey of India, which Tahir has explained so well. There's a third one which we have missed out in this, and some point we should bring it, is that Goa is also fortunate to be part in UNESCO's list for natural heritage, the Madhav Gadgil exercise encompassing 7 states. The areas within the 7 states where flora and fauna have to be conserved has been so beautifully taken and enlisted now with UNESCO. And Goa has a very large proportion of it in its small state. So these are the 3 areas where we are involved in. But as I said, the role of UNESCO is to promote heritage on a very sovereign subject. They're very cautious of it. And most of heritage in India is covered by some law or the other. Now coming to Old Goa in particular, as Tahir has rightly brought out, 14 of the 21 monuments of Goa are in Old Goa. 7 are scattered all over, like the mosque in Ponda, a couple of temples, and so on, outside this belt. Of the 14, the 7 major ones, as he has also brought out, have elements which need being protected for the world to know. As far as Bon Jesus is concerned, it is only the facade which has certain elements, what they say, because Goa was brought into this list by ASI in 1968, and the UNESCO list was published in 72, right? A very interesting point which has been made by Tahir and myself, I've been discussing this, is there's a little conflict in Bon Jesus because there is a thing called the Chapel of St. Francis. The state list also has a Chapel of St. Francis, but we found out the one which is in the central list is not really the Chapel of St. Francis, it's the crypt, right? And you have mentioned it, but the dictionary says a crypt is something within a chapel, but you did mention that the mausoleum was built by an Italian sculptor. And I think one of the speakers has brought out is only the mausoleum part which was provided by the Italian sculptor. But the actual tomb was by Indian craftsmen and placed there. And what has been repaired now is the tomb through the great efforts of our stakeholders and under Father Patricio, right? And that will be now available. There's a very interesting story on this because there was a move made to move that. It was in a state of decay, and I think some Portuguese experts wanted to take it out. But the ASI rightly said, no, this is part of Indian heritage. You cannot take it out. And you find Indian craftsmen. And they did find, and ultimately it worked. So I think this is a very important area that we have to bring in. Another point is where you mentioned Santa Monica. And you mentioned Santa Monica because it was an importance was that they experimented with a lot of plants like the potato, and even the Jesuits and all of, or the Franciscans brought in the caju, etc. But what I want to point out to you, as far as I know, the entire island of Vashi, which is 14 square kilometers, I think, if I'm not mistaken, was part of Santa Monica for the experimentation. Now, the person who, that is where the experimentation took place. And one person who knew this very well and fought very hard was Father, I must remember him, Father Bismarck, right? He fought very hard to save Vashi. Unfortunately, we have lost it. I thought this was a good place to bring this to the forefront. And I think all this will be recorded. It's a very, and I must congratulate Heta and the team for laying stress on such discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Edgar. And I mean, it's a privilege for me to work at this very historic monument at Santa Monica, of course, in the Museum of Christian Art, but it feels very special. And we were hoping to do a heritage walk of the convent next month, but keeping in mind the restrictions with COVID, it might not happen, but we will be having a PhD, Dr. Rosalie Vegas from Brazil, who will be making a presentation next month on life in the convent. And we will be putting it out as a Zoom session. And I hope you all can all join us then. Again, back to Q&A. And if there's any question for Tahir or Sonia, please go ahead.
I just want to say something, not really a question, but it's for Sonia ma'am. I was so happy that I got a chance to learn the Fado online last year during the pandemic. As Sonia ma'am said, she has started the Fado de Goa concept online, which is so helpful to spread the awareness of Fado, because here in Pune, you know, I can explain people, because here in Pune, people don't know much about, you know, the Goan heritage and all that. So I was very happy to learn that, a basic level. And yeah, just want to say that. And yeah, Tahir, I just have a question for you about Gothic churches. I believe Goa doesn't have many Gothic churches, right? Or just help me understand, I could be wrong. It just has one or two, right? So what's the difference between a Gothic church and any normal church in Goa? Like
okay, so actually, if one asks me, Goa has no Gothic churches, but it has a couple of neo-Gothic churches, which is a rediscovery of Gothic in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where people started to go back to those ideas. A Gothic architecture focuses a lot in these tall, elongated structures. Notre Dame is one of the best examples. A lot of use of gargoyles.
This is in France. Yeah.
Yes, in France.
Yes,
France was the heart of the Gothic.
For the yes.
So stained glass windows. I mean, the neo-Gothic church that most people talk about in Goa is the Saligao Church.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tahir. Yeah.
Can I come in once more? Yeah.
Sure.
You know, again, Tahir, you did mention about the role. Again, I'm harping on the role of UNESCO, and you did say that what happened in Oman. But let me tell you, we have an example of what happened in India at Hampi. At Hampi, because that was a very vast area, and there was an intervention due to the mining lobby of building that bridge. And a lot of activists got very angry and said, we will write to UNESCO, right, to stop it. And the government of India said, UNESCO has no role. The subject is sovereign, yes. And UNESCO confirmed it. We have no role, but what we can do, we will delist you. That is what UNESCO said. We will not put it enough. What means your tourism footfalls are bound to drop. You'll be surprised to know not only was the central government upset about that, so was the state government. And the Karnataka government introduced a special act, a state act called the Hampi Conservation Act. So Government of India does need UNESCO, but UNESCO does know its role, how to work with the Government of India. And another point you had raised about the 100 crore project for Old Goa. There are a lot of, Government of India is giving a lot of money. The 100 crore Prasad project cannot be used for preservation, conservation issues, because that is the role of the ASI and for the extended area of the National Monuments Authority. So this money goes through another government department, which is tourism. So around it, you can do a lot of tourism, but there's no intervention that can take place for preservation in Bon Jesus without ASI coming in. If the Government of India say, if the ASI can get involved, how can you help the ASI? Then you can come in. Otherwise, you cannot come in. If you're not happy with that, take the whole thing out of the ASI protection list. Tamil Nadu has done that in one very important temple of theirs, because they said the ASI intervention is too strong, the Devasthan intervention is too strong. We feel better to intervene directly with our people who come to our temple, and it works that way. So that's how it is done. Sorry. Thank you.
No, it's always a pleasure to hear your experiences, Edgar, because they are experiences that span different years in the country. Anyone else has questions for Sonia or me?
Hi, this is Samuel. So basically, I'm a Goan studying in Pune. So my question is to Sonia ma'am. So ma'am, as you said that Fado was present in Goa even during the 1800s. So my question was, is there any Konkani music which is inspired by Fado?
If you are referring to the Mando, are you referring to the Mando, or you just ask a general question?
I'm not referring to Mando. I'm asking a general question.
Okay.
Like
Because
besides Mando.
Yeah, because a lot of people, there's a lot of people who say that Mando is the Goan Fado, and Mando was inspired by the Fado. But even Zé Pereira, and I also agree, the Mando in Goa and the Fado in Portugal developed around the same time. So it was not possible for us to say that the Mando was influenced by the Fado, because they had Fado in Portugal, we had Mando in Goa. No, it just came up around the same time. I guess it was an era for that sort of music, and the Mando developed. So I do not believe that the Mando was inspired by the Fado. As far as any other music form, I don't know of any Konkani music form that was inspired or that came from the Fado. I don't think so, because yes, Fado came here in the 1800s, but it was not like the music genre happening everywhere. It was happening in Goa, but in very small, very close-knit, very aristocratic places. You know, it wasn't like today in Goa we have Konkani Kantar happening all over. You know, so that is a much bigger. But I don't think I have not come across any Konkani music form inspired by the Fado. No.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Pleasure.
Samuel, for your question. And is there anybody else who would like, who has questions for Tahir, Sonia?
May I ask one? It's Narissa.
Narissa, yes, please go ahead.
Thanks. I suppose I want to ask a reverse question. So we've been talking a lot about, colonial influence in Goa or in the rest of India, and also, both in architecture as well as in our art forms. I wanted to get a sense perhaps from any of the speakers if the reverse has happened. So has Goan architecture, ways of life, art form Do you see influences in either, well, in this case, Portuguese art form and architecture?
I think both of us can answer this. So yes, definitely in terms of the architecture, there is a lot of influence from the Portuguese in Goa, but a lot of it was also trial and error. So like I said before, there was a little bit of syncretism. Concepts came from the West, got executed in the East, and you get this mix, which is neither Portuguese nor Indian, which is uniquely Goan. There's a nice book on the Goan church architecture called Whitewash Red Stone by Paulo Varela Gomes, which really focuses on this idea. But because a lot of these concepts came from the West, even if then one looks at, so something that interests me also is language a lot. The idea in Konkani, we call a table a maize, which is also what it is in Portuguese. And now I think maize is even in many Indian languages what means table. So furniture, the concept of many of the furnitures that we use today also comes from the West, mostly through Portugal. Yeah.
Thanks. I was asking about the opposite. So if we find Goan influences in Portugal, for example, or in Portuguese style and architecture.
Can I answer that? Can I? Sonia? You go ahead.
Just one thing I would like to say. So as far as Fado is concerned, we do not see any influence of Goan music there, because a majority of the music in Goa prior to the Portuguese was Indian music or local music, was Goan music. The Portuguese brought in Western classical, and then we had all the Western instruments being learned in Goa. But however, in recent times, say in the last 30 odd years, there is a musician called Rauquiao who plays the bansuri, and he's Portuguese. You find him playing fado on the flute. So that is one thing that we can say has gone from here, has gone there. And today we are experimenting with fado with Indian instruments. So we've used sitar, we've used bansuri, we've used santoor, we have used tabla, of course, in the fado, and it's very well received there among the fado music lovers in Portugal. But I would not be able to say that Goan music as such influenced the fado, at least the fado, no.
Thank you. I'm pleased to hear that.
Yeah, there is one architectural art form called kavi, which I believe originated in Goa. It's a Hindu, it must have started as a Hindu art form for sacred spaces in Hindu temples and sacred spaces in houses. And then came to the churches in Old Goa. You can still see samples of it. And through the Spanish missionaries has gone all over the world. In fact, I've recently seen it in California in the US.
Yes.
It's taken a slightly different form, but they call it sgraffito in the West.
Yeah.
But it's actually derived from the traditional Goan. So yeah, a lot of our art and all the more in Goan contemporary art and architecture, the Portuguese government have been calling in Portuguese developers have been now looking to the colonies to get some of their notable buildings done. I think Kavi is the best example of maybe a Goan thing going there in its own form.
But basically, we have to remember that Old Goa was an entrepot between East and West due to the Portuguese discovery of the Astro, whatever it is. The ships came to Goa, went eastwards and vice versa. So the influence from the West coming to Goa, from Goa going to the East, from East coming to Goa and going to the West. So you do get that influence. I'm sure that has had a big role to play right from the 16th century onwards. It's a major role which Old Goa as a location played. It was an entrepot between East and West. I think this is for you to mull on, but I think that is what has led to this exchange. Maybe this may answer partly Nerissa's question, because the influences are there.
Thank you so much. I guess I had a supplementary question, if I may, at this point.
Yes, that will be one of our last questions because we'll have to wind up the session after this. Go ahead, Nerissa.
Thank you. So in that sense, I was interested in hearing a little bit, in addition to what you have already talked about in terms of preserving heritage, culture, art form. So I guess the part that may be, and I might be wrong, is missing is a recognition or acknowledgement of the people. So the Luso-Indian or whichever other sort of class you want to mention, the mix and the change, the anthropology, and how that is recognized and preserved in itself and in its own right, if that makes sense.
I think this is the first of many discussions, and I mean, these issues of syncretism are so complex that maybe me and Sonia are again quite driven in our own fields and may not be, but I hope that Goa Heritage Action Group and Museum of Christian Art continue to bring on more people and do more of these so that we hear more voices from different development spheres and can shed more light on this.
Very quick announcement. We are to continue our celebrations of World Heritage Day. We are having a webinar on 19th, Monday at 3:30 in the afternoon in collaboration with the Don Bosco College of Engineering. So please do register or please do log in whenever if you get a chance. It's on the Basilica of Bom Jesus, and our speakers are Fernando Velho and Father Patricio and architect Vishwesh Kanolkar. So thank you all for joining us. It's been a pleasure and a learning experience.
Yes.
No question, but I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank Tahir, Sonia, Etta, and Edgar. Edgar, sorry, what have I done?
No, we can hear you, Mr. Nassi.
We can see you. And
all I want to say, it was a pleasure having Edgar, who's such an authority. I have the greatest respect for him. I'm so glad to have him here today. I've learned a lot. For instance, I always thought that the Mando was inspired by the Fado. I didn't know anything about, where the potatoes were first grown. I knew that they were brought to Goa, brought to India by the Portuguese, but I didn't know they were test grown at Santa Monica. So I've learned a lot, and I thank everyone very much.
For all of you who, this is Mr. Nascimento de Souza, lovingly called Nassi, who is the Vice President of the Managing Committee of the Museum of Christian Art. Thank you so much, Mr. Nassi, for attending the session with us this afternoon.
I wouldn't have missed it for anything.
Thank you so much. He's our pillar of strength at the Museum of Christian Art. And hopefully we'll do many more sessions with GHAG, and hoping you all can join us for the sessions like Heta said on the 19th is a session, a webinar. There's also another one on the 22nd of May. Of that we will share the information shortly. Thank you all.